Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's OpenTeams community event. OpenTeams gives you access to the best open source architects in the world to help you train, support, and deliver your software solutions. I'm Brian Skin, Community Manager at OpenTeams, and I'll be your host for today. Today, we are joined by Colby M. White, Staff Software Engineer at Fractal, for an open source architect spotlight event entitled Full Stack Web Design, Origins, Evolution, and Outlook. As the title implies, today's conversation with Colby is going to explore full stack web design. What is it? Where did it come from? Where is it now? What advantages does it provide? And what might be in store for it in the future? We are open for audience questions. Please post any you might have into the chat, and we'll work them in as we can. Colby, welcome to you. How are you today?
Doing well, doing well. How about yourself?
Doing all right. So, full stack. That's where we're headed, but let's start a little earlier. What's your background? How did you get into software and development?
Yeah, I think my first role, during college, internship style, classic archetype there. But I was doing that at a startup. So as you're kind of aware, you're at a startup, you got to wear multiple hats, right? So we didn't have a CI/CD system or any kind of operation or anything like that. So it was a matter of let's just figure it out. So me being a young, naive engineer, I just put the hat on, and let's go. And it's now I got hired to do some Java stuff, typical backend stuff, but now I'm doing DevOps. I'm helping with the UI, the whole shebang, right? So this is before I even realized there was a front end back end divide, right? So I think I just kind of naively have always been doing all the things, um, and not even asking any questions about it until later when I realized, oh, some of the people on the back end don't necessarily even want to come over here on the front end. So I think I've been um, a little bit full stack minded since day one, for
Mm,
better or for worse. I would argue for better, but maybe others would argue different. But yeah, so that's kind of how I kind of stumbled into this topic.
Interesting. Yeah, would you say in your experience that more people, more devs than not, tend to think in that front end back end dichotomy, or?
Yeah, definitely for sure. I mean, some of it is a little self-referential. Maybe that might not be the right word, but that's what our job titles are. So it just
Mhm.
reinforces the behavior. Now, why do the job titles have that? Because engineers have already started thinking about that. You get a chicken and the egg kind of thing there. But, fast forward 30, 40 years, right? It's pretty ingrained that there's this front end, back end divide.
Mhm. So I guess of the various languages you've worked in, just to set a bit more perspective, what would you say is, what's been your favorite to work in over time? Kind of like the Stack Exchange survey, most loved, most hated, and most
Right.
excited to learn, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think over the last, I don't know, 5, 6 years, the JavaScript slash TypeScript ecosystem has made some pretty good gains. So that's been my number one for a while now. As I mentioned earlier, I kind of started out with Java, but just my personality type, it wasn't too long before I started learning Python for the sake of learning Python, and then started
Mm.
using that in some production things, and then went from there and learned. I remember I got dazzled by Rails, so that was like a 9 months honeymoon of being obsessed with Rails. What else out there? I've done some Clojure. I think Clojure was when I really kind of discovered functional programming and went down that road. Elm is another one. I guess that is very heavily JavaScript. It compiles down to JavaScript, but so yeah, I've my personality type just kind of I want to learn new things. So, but like I said, over the last 5 years, I've really kind of settled on the JavaScript slash TypeScript ecosystem.
Mhm. Excellent. Yeah, I've the JavaScript I've been doing recently has been heavy on TypeScript, and with the IDE integration and all the aspects of that is like, I
Mhm.
understand the value here and really appreciate it.
Yep, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, once
All right. So,
you get the types in there, it kind of unlocks your capability there. So.
mhm, yeah, the facilitating really large scale architecture, because there are lots of things it takes care
Absolutely.
of for you.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So, artificial divide, front end versus back end. It makes sense, coming in, not being, not knowing from the outset, oh, there are these two different things, and having to discover. Um, Tell us more about that, and
Mhm.
how, I guess, the kind of foreshadowing with the conversation to come, where convergence onto full stack frameworks as a single entity. Just talk some more about that front end back end dichotomy, and what full stack is, and work into the advantages that you get when you go to full stack.
Yeah, so I think some history is useful here. I'm not going to claim to be a historian, but based on my understanding, right? I think there's that story about JavaScript being created in like 10 days, right? So very quick, it's POC, it's out the door, and now it's going out there. I think there was some reaction to that was like, how can you do that in 10 days, right? Like that can't be a real programming language. I think uh, some of the just the response to that was that. But also, I do think there's some people who just had like, particularly in those early days, had a technical, uh, I don't want to call it beef, but critiques, some valid technical critiques around the programming language of JavaScript, right? So there's a little bit of suspicion in those early days of like, what is this, yada yada yada. But fast forward to today, right? I think the key thing for me to understand, and maybe it goes back to that startup mindset of wearing multiple hats, is uh, 9 times out of 10, I'm working at a company and we deliver our product through the browser. And it is what it is, right? Like that, we're doing SaaS probably. That's one of the dominant business models in our industry now. So there's a browser, and if you're going to deliver your product through the browser, you're using JavaScript. So once you have that, like, kind of, regardless of your opinions of the language, regardless of the history and any kind of shade you want to throw at it, you're going to have to deal with it.
Mhm.
Uh, so I think, and when I talked about like some of the recent developments, right, one of those is that TypeScript. And for me, that really has, I'm kind of a typed oriented kind of guy, that has really unlocked it. Like, but since day one, I've been understanding like I'm going to have to use this, because for me, all right, and I think it's important for everyone to realize, to kind of state this explicitly. I think we all have it implicitly in our head, but to state it explicitly is important. We don't get paid if our for loops are beautiful, right? We get paid if we deliver customer value. Our customers don't care about for loops or unsigned integers and all that good stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That we get interested in that, understandably so. We're all got a little nerd in us, right? So it's easy for us to get nerd sniped, as they say. But uh, we got to stay eyes on the prize, and eyes on the prize is customer value. And I can't deliver customer value without the browser, which means I can't deliver customer value without JavaScript. So I'm going to interact with it in order, right?
And
And like I said,
especially with things, like, to interject, especially things like Electron apps and progressive web apps and things, the range of applicability of where you can
keeps
deliver
growing.
something using a
Yep,
browser is expanding.
that's a great point, because that's one of the evolution, so to speak, in the last however many years is uh, the thought of doing some of this stuff in a browser probably would have blew our minds in the mid 90s, right? With those
Oh yeah.
very old school blinking things on the website, that wasn't really feasible in that time. But the evolution has grown, and you talked about PWAs, right? I'm a big fan of the PWAs, and particularly from a business standpoint, because I think there's a lot of companies who think they need a mobile app, but if they really sat down and looked at what PWAs can accomplish in 2023, they're like,
Hmm.
wait a second, maybe I don't. I thought I needed that because I needed access to the
Yeah.
picture, but wait, PWAs do that too. So
Why build three
uh,
projects instead of one?
exactly, yeah. So it really, those evolutions to me have really, not only is it like a begrudging thing, like, oh, I gotta use JavaScript. Like now it's like, wait a second, this is a fine ecosystem. It's a powerful
Yeah.
ecosystem. There's a lot of different things I can do. Um, so yeah, it's been an interesting, however many 5-10 years or whatever for the
Hmm.
JavaScript ecosystem.
Yeah, yeah. So it's, JavaScript is, I think it's fair to say it's here to stay, barring some long-term evolution, which
Mhm.
I don't see any signs of yet. Um, but then, so original web was, CSS or CSS, HTML on the front end, CGI
Right.
scripts on the back end.
Mhm.
Very much not a unified
Right.
framework.
Right.
So kind of trace, quickly from there the technologies from, the good old days of the internet to what we have today.
Yeah, so I think that's a great way to start it, right? Is HTML, CSS, maybe a little bit of JavaScript, but most of your logic is, PHP, JSP, ASP, pick your acronym of choice, right? And you're kind of interacting that way. And what ends up happening is I kind of call it a fairly artificial divide, but I can understand why people would look at that and see a divide, right? Because it
Mhm.
feels like two different skill sets. HTML is I kind of made fun of people who were hating on JavaScript as not a real programming language. I'm going to be a little guilty here. HTML is not a programming language, right? It's a markup language. That's what the ML
Indeed.
stands for, right? So it's just
Yep.
fundamentally different than something like PHP or something, right? So it feels different, first and foremost. When I'm over here doing PHP, one of the main things I'm doing is I'm dealing with SQL queries and dealing with the database, right? That feels astronomically different than what's going on the front end. So it makes sense to me why like we start to get this little separation, right? But fast forward over time, and I think in many ways, Node was a big item on this timeline, so to speak. If we were kind of loosely
Yeah.
fast forward through the history, I think that Node thing is a pretty big thing there because now what's going on over here on the back end doesn't feel as different anymore, right? Because A, same language, first off,
Mhm.
but then
Yep.
B, it's like now I'm starting to do the same things in the language. Also around about that same time, the way we were building websites became a little different, right? It wasn't just HTML, CSS with a little JavaScript sprinkled on top, right? It's heavily JavaScript, right? It's like we're building, particularly the SPA movement, right? The single page app movement. Um, you can't even render the page without JavaScript, right? It's not progressive
Yeah.
enhancement, it's required, right? So you start to get to this um, you start to slowly get into this world where the skill sets are starting to converge.
Mhm.
Uh, I'm not only are the languages converging because maybe people are using JavaScript in the back end, but the skill sets are converging, right? Because even on the front end, in a classical front end, a spa front end, I'm doing a lot of the same things, right? What's a common thing you do in the back end? State management. What do I got to do in
Oh,
my
yeah.
component? State management, right? You start to get this overlap. I gotta do APIs. That sounds like a backend thing, but I'm doing that from my spa. I'm mutating data. Sounds like a backend thing, but I'm doing that in my spa. So you just like slowly but surely kind of get to this spot where they're converging. And I think I'll just go ahead and kind of shout out Chris Coyer. He's done a lot of great work in writing this up. He's got this great talk called "Oops, are we all full stack developers now?" And he kind of outlines how it was slow. I don't think it was like a magical a big bomb dropped and now all of a sudden these are the same thing. It was a very slow thing. You start to get these frameworks that started to grow and have more capabilities. Now you're getting routing into them. That kind of sounds like a back end, but now we're doing that at the front end, right? You start to slowly get this
Interesting.
iteration. And I think one thing to call out is the components. Once we all started kind of realizing using components was the right answer to build our front ends,
Mhm. Mhm.
uh, that certainly sounds front end, right? But when you think about it for a second, to zoom out, well, that's the DRI principle, right? And then
Mhm.
we've been doing that on the back end for years. So now it's like a very similar sentiment. And I definitely had this in my past
Oh, yeah.
where, I forgot someone on my team who hates JavaScript. They don't want to look at it. But then I pull them over and I'm like, hey, how should we organize these components? And then you can see it like flip, like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm the same thing. You know what I'm saying? Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's like this slow convergence. And then I think to get back to the what's been going on the last 5-10 years, I think the emergence of these full stack frameworks, I really think they are a consequence of that. They're starting to see all that. Node is be growing, so that the capabilities are growing, and then they end up in a spot where now we can build a full stack framework where now it's like official, right? It's not like I do this thing, I chuck it over to the backend guy, he chucks it back over to me, blah blah blah. Uh, we can all do this one and in the same framework and same language. So I, it's when you start to look at, like I said, it's slow, but when you zoom out and start to think about it, it all kind of makes sense. And it's like we
Mhm.
never really saw it in real time happening, right?
Yeah. The natural evolution of the technologies in a direction that makes sense with the functional and design constraints of the applications and the needs.
Yeah.
Mhm. Excellent. So, So web is not my background. So I am coming in a bit from the outside here. I could rattle off a list. I know Node on the back end for JavaScript, and I could rattle off Angular and Vue and React and all sorts of front end frameworks. Can you dig it, partly in some sense, just to help me understand, can you dig a bit more deeply into, when we were discussing prior to the conversation, you mentioned Remix and Next.js as examples of true full stack frameworks. Um, can you talk a bit, help expand a bit on what is it that makes, for example, Next different from an app where you have say a Node backend and a React front end? What's different in
Yeah.
working with it? How does it work differently?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So, the way I think about that is a front end framework, if its main goals are to help you produce, to crank out components and maybe route to, a page component or something, and then that's it, and it's probably, I would classify that as on this side of the divide, so to speak. Like it's concerned about front end only data and all that good stuff. You're on your own to go figure out, right? And usually we're all going to kind of follow a pattern, right? We use a fetch request to an API, and that API is being built by a different framework, right? Maybe that's
Mhm.
a better way to even word it. Like if it's not giving you a way to build out your API endpoint yourself, then it's probably only focused on the front end, right?
Mhm.
Remix, Next. I think there's like Astro full stack framework now, Svelte Kit, which is doing it for Svelte. I think even Solid, I think it's called Solid Start, I think has one for the Solid JS. These are all frameworks that are trying to put those two concepts together, right? Because it's important to back up, right? This is what we're all doing. This is what we've been doing for the last 10 years, right? We build a component. What does the component do? It makes a call to the backend, gets some data, and renders, right? So it makes sense to me to kind of couple that in some way. I think, coupling can be bad, and that's a word we all got to use with caution in engineering. But I do think this can be this is a good coupling, I think, particularly at the page level or at the route level of, I'm going to the page. We're all probably doing a very similar flow. I hit the page, we go to the back end, render the data. If there's an error, we got to show an error component. We probably need a loading icon. It's the same 3 or 4 steps that we're all coding. So these full stack frameworks are kind of helping that. And I'll kind of highlight Remix, right? Because Remix is uh, a lot of times when you're talking and comparing frameworks, the differences are marginal. So I'm not here to get into a framework war or anything, but I think Remix is relevant to this conversation a little uniquely because what they're doing, as the name implies, they're taking the old way we were doing things, that old PHP kind of way of doing things, and just
Mhm.
remixing it with the modern tools and technologies, right? So they're kind of recognizing I just feel like when you're using Remix, it becomes a little more explicit about, you start to see the history explicitly, I guess is what I'm saying.
Uh,
It's like I'm so used to this client, excuse me, singles page app where, I only need JavaScript. I can't even run this thing without JavaScript, and Remix is. And I remember before that, right, where it's like everything was a multi-page app. So every time I do a route, I got to sit there and wait for the thing to make a
mhm.
whole new web request, right? That whole clunky thing. Remix is kind of taking that history, taking those two eras, so to speak, remix it up together, stir it in a pot, and now we have this thing where we can kind of leverage the strengths of both. Um, and to get back to your question, I think that is the power of the full stack, right? I don't think you can do that if you're thinking in this world of like, well, no, that's backend stuff. I can't do that. That's front end stuff. I can like you don't even start to
Mhm.
think about these things unless you're blending them together. So
Okay. So one analogy that's coming to mind, and I'm curious if you think it's apt. I know there was a surge of companies using the microservices model for their applications. So the two ends of that spectrum, the monolith and the microservice.
mhm,
The
mhm,
analogy that that's starting to occur to me at least is that the front end back end is almost like a two-piece microservices like sort of setup, whereas a full stack, you I don't know, widen the port or the
mhm, mhm.
interface. So instead of shoving your data through a narrow channel between your front and your back end, you widen that so that the communication is more general and more extensive between the two. Or is that anywhere in the ballpark?
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. I think the analogy might work better for like a mental model of how we approach it, right? And that's where the similarities there are. Is like microservices. We're going to look at every little thing and split it up, and we're kind of doing that with our apps, right? We looked at the front end. It starts here. That's one thing. That's a separate thing, right? So I think it was like an approach of like making everything small. I think there is some overlap there. One is kind of horizontal and one is kind of vertical, but
Mm,
I think you're onto something there.
okay. Yeah. The it seems like the breadth, again, that the reach that the code has on the front end into back end matters is just
Yeah,
more extensive in full stack. Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Um, okay. So full stack, we've described it. Now make the case for it. So you have the history, and it's fitting the way that the work on the web is happening anyways. So what are some practical consequences of that? What do you
Yeah.
gain from going full stack?
Well, so first let's kind of describe the old way. And when I say the old way, I mean more in how we developed as a team. Um, if I'm working on a classical single page application, I've got a feature I got to do, right? I'll make up a feature, right? Click a button and maybe something gets saved to the database, right? Well, what do we always do in grooming? Those become two different stories. Well, one, we need a story to build the button, and another, we need a story to actually save it to the database. And then, of course, there's always that little gray area. Well, who do we need a separate story for telling the button, like integrating the button to the endpoint? Like, is that the backend story? Is that the front? Right? You get this whole thing, and now you have a dependency. Not only in the fact that from an agile sense, you got two stories that depend on each other, but from a human sense, right? Because we've all kind of put ourselves in these front end back end buckets. Well, only the front end folks can do this
Uh,
story, and only the back end folks can do this story. Now
right,
we're moving
right.
slower. Our velocity is hit, right? Because
Hmm.
hey, we got dependencies. We got to wait for Joe Blow over here to get free so you can build the button, but we already got the back end and we can't release it. Here we go, right? So this all comes down to me. The biggest endpoint or the biggest benefit here is vertical slices, and even in that front end back end divide, I was always trying to work in that capacity. I don't want a story that is build a button. It's like, what does that do? Like, I want a story that is deliver this customer value, right? I want to allow somebody to save a thing of a jig so they can use it later, as a user, blah 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 blah, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in order to do that, I need a button and I need database. So for me, in my mindset, it's like that's how I want to work. I want to work where I'm
Integrated.
dealing. And when I'm done, customer value has been delivered. I don't want to be
Mm,
done like, yeah, my button's done, but hey, I need the database guy to do something, right? This is not that makes me move slower personally. This is my personal opinion, but it's not satisfying, right? Like I want to be
mhm.
done and like see it go out the door and like on all the customers rejoice, right?
Yeah,
So to
yeah.
me, that is the main benefit is that velocity impact of working in a having the ability. Just because you do full stack frameworks doesn't mean you're going to make your stories like that, right? But now you can, and you can
Mhm.
work in vertical slices. You get the velocity impact. Um, from a more technical standpoint, I know a lot of people, one of the things that they think about is being able to share types or share things. It might be types, might be interfaces, whatever the case may be, share it across that divide, right? Because we're sending the same thing back and forth across the wire.
Yeah.
Let's write it once, and go from there. I think that is an important impact. Obviously, there are ways to do that without a full stack framework. So that's kind of the case with any technical benefit. There's usually trade-offs and a way to get it another way, but here it's kind of like a free thing.
Mhm.
I said I had to work that hard to get it, so that's another benefit as well. So, but yeah, like I said, for me, it's philosophy. I'm not here to, like I mentioned earlier, I'm not here to craft perfect for loops. I'm here to deliver value. So,
Right.
and this helps them do it faster. So,
Yeah, I can completely identify with that, kind of redrawing the boundaries of any individual developer's responsibility in a project, instead of being, the horizontal slices of do this part of this deliver, this, it's the wrong word for it, but qualitative deliverable to the customer. You can
mhm.
refactor it to where any given individual has something that they can implement technically, but then have a business value deliverable that they can
Absolutely,
own
yeah,
on whatever
yeah,
scale. Yeah, fits the human factor
absolutely.
better.
And worded that right, human factor, right? So we're thinking in terms of somewhat not abstract, but like somewhat theoretical, I guess. Uh,
Mm.
that's a utopia. I've learned that there are going to be people who are a lot more comfortable building components than they are adding a column to the database,
Sure.
and that's perfectly fine. So you're definitely going to have some emphasis there where someone's a little more focused on one side or the other.
Yeah.
Uh, but just having the capability to like, hey, I got to add a column to the database. I'm just going to go do it. Just having that capability, A, we talked about the velocity, but B, it also starts to improve, in my opinion, improves the quality of your engineers because
Mm.
now you're not one trick ponies. And again, that's a little bit of my bias because like from day one, the notion of being a one trick pony never even entered my mind. Uh, but yeah, I'm all for jack of all trades, and this gives you a capability. And you don't necessarily have to, because I certainly think people are going to be like, no, I'm going to be the database wizard. I'm going to know everything about indexes, and that's fine. And you probably need a handful of those people in a large
Hmm.
organization, right?
The deep
You need some
knowledge. Yeah.
special,
Mhm.
exactly. You need some specialization. But I think for me, defaulting to being able to do jack of all trades style, it has a bigger impact on your velocity.
Mhm. I like that, lowering the barrier around any given developer so that, "Oh, hey, we need this other thing done. You have some margin in your bandwidth. It's not that far off what you've done before. Could you take it on?" Sure,
Exactly.
rather than, "Oh, this is a completely different, technology, so to
Mhm.
speak, and,
Yeah,
a bigger lift." Yeah.
and I mentioned earlier how I feel like this transition has kind of happened slowly over the last couple of decades. The fact that now we have full stack frameworks, I think what you're just describing, I think that's accelerating things.
Yeah, sure.
It's to allude to that tongue in cheek title of Chris Coyer's talk. Oops, we're all full stack developers. I think that's what people are realizing. It's like, oh, I could have did this. Like this is I'm not scared anymore, right? It's like
Yeah,
so now it's possible. The door is open. You peek through, and you're like, wait a second, I could. There's no demons back here. Like it's just code,
yeah,
right? Code is code. So I think
yeah.
it's kind of accelerated that blending.
It's always interesting, technological innovation in general. Kind of we get some people are specifically trying to drive innovation, but then sometimes things advance and somebody looks around and goes, "So wait a minute, what just
Yeah,
happened
exactly.
over the last 5 years?" And then noticing a paradigm shift, after the fact more than necessarily
That's
seeing
true.
it as it's
That's true.
happening. So, speaking of paradigm shifts, we want to talk a bit about the future of full stack. So, full stack is here. We have these frameworks that are specifically, um, trying to implement it in a smart way. Um, what does the future look like? More JavaScript? Are there, does this potentially expand to other, like we you talked before about JavaScript likely being around for the foreseeable future? Um, Talk a bit about that. Obviously, none of us can predict the future, but where do you see the trends going?
Yeah, so I think we're there's always a little bit of a cycle, right? And I think we're in a part of the cycle right now where we're seeing a boom in frameworks, right? We've got a lot of different frameworks who are telling this story. They're all telling their story in a slightly different way, but we're
Mhm.
seeing that kind of explosion. And I actually do think we're starting to kind of reach the end of that. And I think because what follows is we start to coalesce, right? Because we had this in the spa days, right? Like when the frameworks to build a spa, there was an explosion. There was just a new framework every week, and then what happened? We started to coalesce. It was Angular, React, Vue. Uh, those are the big three. We all kind of coalesced around that. So I'm starting
Yeah.
to see that mainly with
Ah.
Next.js, and this is really like this year. Next.js is really particularly with that Next.js conference they've really kind of positioned themselves to be the big player here. Which like I said earlier, I'm more of a Remix guy, but I mean Next.js is pretty damn awesome as well. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think there is a little trepidation when the industry starts to coalesce around something, and the people who aren't necessarily fans of that start to get a little worried. But I do think there is a little value of coalescing that. That way, there's not a gazillion options. Let's take that down to maybe two or three, right?
Mhm.
So I sense that that's what's going to happen here in the next years, and we've definitely seen so obviously Next.js and Versal are at the hip. Uh, Shopify just bought Remix.
Ah.
Netlify just bought Gatsby. Right, we're starting to see now the money start to flow in. So
Ah.
I sense that there's going to be some. coalescing. Now, who stands up on top at the end? That I won't predict because I don't know. But
Yeah.
I do think we'll have some coalescing now. Um, so yeah, and you asked about JavaScript in particular. I do think for the foreseeable future, JavaScript slash TypeScript are going to be the main code du jour in this field. Uh, and I think that's going to hold for a while. And my big asterisk there, and this is where like we're reaching the edge of my knowledge, and I think it becomes about WebAssembly and where WebAssembly comes in the foreseeable future, in the next however many years. And I admittedly don't know enough about WebAssembly to have like a healthy prediction, but it just seems like what they're aiming for there gets us at a point where now perhaps we don't necessarily need, because earlier I talked about you got the browser, you have to use JavaScript. They might break
Mhm.
that, right? They might say, yes, you're
Yeah.
in the browser, but there's also some other options, right? And if they get to a point where it's like I can write something in Python and it compiles down the WebAssembly and now we're good to go and it's effective and it's the DX is around. I think that's the main key right now in the
Mhm.
WebAssembly thing is that the DX is not necessarily have the greatest story, or at least not as well as these JavaScript frameworks. So if that levels up, then that whole point I made about if you're in the browser, you're doing JavaScript, and that gets broken, then like Wild Wild West, right? Who knows what happens after that, right? Now
Yeah.
maybe we're back into these wars of this is the best programming language, that's the best program. Who knows, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, so
Yeah.
that becomes the big mystery I see, or the big unknown on the horizon, so to speak.
Another another explosion coalescence cycle potentially.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Like maybe we get a bunch of WebAssembly frameworks, right? And then we go
Right.
through
Right.
and
Right.
do this whole thing again, right?
Just for the reference of anybody who might not be familiar, can you do just a quick, minute summary of what WebAssembly is, how it works?
Yeah, see, I think, and then again, this is going to be a big asterisk, right? Because this is, I've been in the JavaScript world, but my understanding of WebAssembly is like we're trying to operate at a lower level in terms of the web.
Hmm.
And can we give, I don't think it's necessarily like bytecode or anything. I might be taking the analogy a little too literal, but it's the idea
Mhm.
of going at a lower level and delivering that. I think my understanding is there's big performance improvements when you do that, as opposed to dealing with HTML, CSS,
Yeah,
or sorry,
definitely.
still dealing with JavaScript, which has to be parsed and then ran. Right now, we're kind of dealing with a lower level,
Mhm.
so maybe the performance is different.
Can
And
intermediate,
then
like an intermediate language or partial
exactly,
compile or something. Yeah.
yeah. Which and again, that's why I'm so interested in it. But having had a chance to really dive deep into it, but I'm interested at a high level because, uh, you know, like I mentioned earlier, HTML, CSS, those aren't programming languages, uh, and we've been stuck with them for so long, and we've been stuck with them because the browsers use it, and like you can't make changes to a browser willy nilly, right? It's like
Mhm. Yeah.
everyone's got that browser. That's a whole ordeal, right? So the browsers tend to move slow
Mhm.
in the big
Because they're
changes.
a platform essentially, and
Exactly.
platforms
That's a
are going to be
great way to
slow.
put it. Yep. Yeah, it's a platform. So if WebAssembly becomes a viable alternative platform, like it's just conceptually interesting to me because it's like,
Yeah,
okay, now we've got a whole new bag of tricks that we can do, a whole new toolbox to deal with. So
indeed. Any other particular topics you'd like to hit before we round out the conversation?
yeah, I think it's important to call out because we're engineers having this conversation, but I do think there's a corollary, and then there's an adjacent conversation with this whole full stack thing when we talk about designers, um, because we talked about you know routing, data mutation, like all these things are happening now on the front end, and that's where we're like the coalescing of our back end skills and our front end skills. But there
Mhm.
are still skills that are very much front end specific, right? Accessibility,
Mm,
design systems,
yeah,
things along those lines, right? Like those are things that I'm not sure everyone is like that. That seems to be a little different, right? And I've heard this referred to as the front of the front end.
hmm,
In my opinion, I think what it is that designers have started, like that industry has started to to mutate as well. If you're a
sure.
designer, in the '90s, you're designing for print, right? fast forward 3 decades, you're designing for web, and over 3 decades, what happens is I think a lot of these designers are starting to realize, well, it behooves me to learn a little bit about CSS. It behooves
Hmm.
me to learn a little bit about HTML. So that way I can interact with my web designs better. And so they're getting a little more
Yeah.
technical. They're not necessarily going all the way,
Yeah.
right? They're not like building React components per se, or at least most of them, but uh, they're definitely adding more value, in my opinion,
Hmm.
by doing that. And so we got design systems becoming a thing, accessibility. I think they're by learning these technical things, they're actually uh, in a great position to help with web performance, right? I think because they're
Yeah.
designers, they're coming at it with a much more customer mind. They're thinking about it from the customer, so they're thinking about it from different browsers, from different mobile devices, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
So they're adding a value here. But I think it becomes a little hard. Like what do we call them? Are they designers? Are they front end developers? Uh,
Right.
are they something else? Some new hybrid? I don't know. Designer plus.
Right.
I'm not sure the answer there, but I think it's notable, and I encourage it. I've worked with those style of designers, and they're a pleasure to work with. Right? They ask you
Hmm.
questions that you never really think about because they're just thinking about the problems different.
Hmm.
And not different in a bad way, different in a way that we should be thinking about them as well. And so like it's a very important skill to bring into this dichotomy, right? Like so for
Yeah.
engineering, we're starting to flatten out, but we got to recognize there's still an edge here that we're missing. But they are also kind of coming in as well. So like how
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
works, I think is important. So
Yeah. The effect, um, it's a goodness, how to put it, a leading edge of exploration in terms of designers thinking, starting to acquire the technical mindset and the technical, bridging into
yeah,
the designer mindset. What can we do with this digital medium, novel, new,
absolutely.
interesting, effective, that just wasn't possible in a static print medium,
Yep,
and
yep.
innovating.
Exactly. Yeah. That's one thing I've learned by bugging my designers over my career is like how difficult, how much more difficult designing for the web is compared to designing for like a magazine. All right. It's like right off the bat, what is your canvas? Like if I'm doing a magazine, 8 by 11, it's web. It's like, I
Mhm.
don't know, the customer can readjust the browser, right? So just that off the bat is just like a different world. But like I said, them kind of becoming a little more technical as you described it, I think that helps all of us. And I do think that there's one thing I'll say is I think where those two worlds absolutely meet and overlap is when it comes to design systems. Uh, some of the tools around building design systems, uh, you know, technical as hell. It's like it's very technical deal to build that out. But that's where the overlap is, right? Because they're cranking out the design system, we're using it, right? And I think understanding that overlap and making sure that that process involves both sides of the house, so to speak,
Mhm.
I think is important. So I'm just wary of us as an industry doing the same thing and making it. It's like, oh, that's their thing. This is our thing, right? And now we're
Mhm.
back into this world. Maybe it's a little
Yeah.
different kind of example, but it feels the same. And it's like I think we should learn from that and like let's figure out how to overlap. And
Yeah.
I think it's happening with all these design system tools. So
Mhm.
um,
I mean,
it's
certainly some of the
interesting.
websites I've seen. I mean, like the Vercel, the Next.js conf, that website, just as one example that I've seen recently, where it's very interactive and like a treasure hunt game built into the browser, and just creative new things
Yep,
that people are doing with web. So
absolutely. Yeah.
so
Yeah, I like that word creativity, right? I think what we do as engineers is incredibly creative, but it's a different kind of creative, right? It's like a more
agreed.
of a mathematical problem solving creative. They come at these problems that are a little more, I forget what side of the brain, left brain, right brain,
Left
or whatever, but they're the
right
other
brain
side
is
of the brain.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So, and in this that approach, right, you get crazy, not crazy, but this incredibly clever output like that. So I think it's important
Absolutely,
to bring that in.
absolutely. Well, I think we're about on time, so we'll wrap it here. Thanks so much, Colby, for your time today. Thank you to the audience for
Absolutely.
attending. I learned a lot. I really appreciate the insight into the full stack frameworks. I'd known a bit, but I appreciate the deeper understanding. Um, the event is recorded for today, and that recording will be posted to OpenTeams.com and our YouTube channel once we have it prepared. That's within a few weeks. So look out for that. That's all for today's event. Remember, OpenTeams gives you access to the best open source architects in the world to help you train, support, and deliver your software solutions. Feel free to go to openteams.com to learn more about OpenTeams, to get to know our open source architect network, or to apply to become an OSA, an architect yourself. Thanks very much. Have a good one.